Picture this. Weeks go by, maybe even months, and your phone stays completely quiet where they're concerned. Then, out of nowhere, a notification pops up. One short message. One name you know all too well. The same person who once left you emotionally exhausted is suddenly acting like they want back into your life. And before you type a single word back, before your feelings take the wheel, there's something you need to understand clearly. That message didn't appear by chance. Their return isn't some random coincidence. And how you choose to respond in this exact moment can shape everything that follows. What happens next may catch you off guard more than you'd think. If you've ever been involved with someone who vanishes for a while and then resurfaces like nothing ever happened, listen closely, because grasping what's really going on here can spare you from months, maybe years, of emotional turmoil. When a person like this finally breaks their silence, the very first thing to understand is this. They're not coming back because they suddenly woke up and realized how much you mean to them. They haven't had some deep emotional breakthrough or genuine moment of remorse. And they certainly haven't transformed into a more self-aware, emotionally mature version of themselves overnight. More often than not, someone like this resurfaces because they need something from you. What they're after is emotional fuel. And that fuel can show up in a lot of different forms. It could be your attention, it could be your approval, it could be your admiration, your emotional reaction, your pity, or simply your curiosity. Sometimes it's nothing more than the reassurance that they still have a way back into your life whenever they decide they want it. Their disappearance was never really about giving you space to heal, and their sudden reappearance isn't proof that they've grown or changed. What drives their behavior is their own internal need, not any real concern for how you're doing emotionally. People who operate this way tend to move through repeating cycles, and silence is simply one stage in that cycle. When one source of attention dries up, when things feel boring, when they've lost their grip on some other situation, or when whatever supply they've been getting elsewhere stops satisfying them, they start looking backward. They think about the people they once had an emotional hold over, not out of love, not out of regret, but because they want to check who's still available to them emotionally. That's exactly why their text can feel so out of place or unexpected. It might land at the strangest times. Sometimes it shows up right when you're finally starting to put yourself back together. Other times it appears the moment you've genuinely moved your focus elsewhere. It can almost feel like they have a radar for the exact moment your emotional distance starts to grow. And in a strange way, they often are attuned to those shifts, not because they care, but because they're wired to notice changes in attention and attachment when it serves their own interests. They usually don't come back because they miss who you are as a person. They come back because they miss what they used to get from you. They miss having access to your emotions. They miss the validation you gave them. They miss that sense of pull they once had over how you felt. What's important to understand here is that this kind of return is often transactional at its core. They're essentially testing the waters to see if that emotional doorway is still open. If you respond with warmth, they get their supply. If you respond with frustration or anger, they still get something out of it. Even a cold, short reply can tell them the connection isn't fully severed. To them, your emotional reactions hold value, almost like a form of currency. And that's precisely why they tend to reach back out whenever they sense that currency slipping through their fingers. Their earlier disappearance fits into this same pattern too. When they go quiet, it's usually because their focus has drifted somewhere else. Maybe another source of validation caught their interest. Maybe they got wrapped up in their own life. Or maybe the silence itself was a tool, a way to create uncertainty and hold on to a sense of control. Whatever the reason, that silence typically benefits them in some way. And the moment it stops working in their favor, they show up again. Their timing is almost never accidental. They tend to reach out during the moments you're most emotionally raw, around meaningful dates, or right when your confidence is finally starting to rebuild itself. People with this pattern often feel unsettled the moment they sense they're losing psychological influence over someone they once had a hold on. So when they resurface, it's usually rooted in self-interest, not in any real sense of emotional accountability or genuine desire to reconnect. This is where a lot of people get tripped up, because the message itself often doesn't come across as harmful at all. In fact, it can seem gentle, thoughtful, even apologetic on the surface. But what actually matters isn't the message you see, it's what's driving it underneath. When someone like this reaches out after going quiet, that message is rarely something they typed in the spur of the moment. Most of the time, it's been thought through, shaped deliberately to get a reaction out of you. They're watching your emotional state closely. They want to know if you still care. They want to see whether you'll still respond to them emotionally. They're essentially gauging whether you're still reachable on that level. Every message they send carries some kind of intention behind it. Something as simple as, "Hey," or "How have you been?" can be a way of testing whether you'll take on the emotional labor of restarting the conversation. A message dripping with nostalgia might be their way of checking whether old memories still stir something in you. Something more vulnerable, like telling you they needed to talk to someone, might be designed to see if you'll still put their emotional needs ahead of your own boundaries. Very little about these messages is truly spontaneous. People like this tend to remember emotional patterns with surprising precision. Over time, your past reactions become part of how they read you. They remember what made you soften up. They remember what triggered your guilt. They remember what kept you around longer than you probably should have stayed. They know what got you explaining yourself, chasing closure, or pulling you back in even after you'd created distance. The message becomes less about reconnecting and more about gathering information. They want to know if you're still emotionally affected by them. They want to know if you still think about them. They're curious whether the silence actually hurt you. They want to confirm whether that access point is still open. Even your hesitation tells them something. Responding right away might signal that you're still emotionally available. A lengthy, heartfelt explanation might suggest lingering attachment. Even a flash of anger can tell them they still hold some kind of emotional weight in your world. Every single reaction you have communicates something back to them. That's why messages like this often carry hidden layers beneath the surface. The wording might look simple and harmless, but underneath, it's often crafted to pull you back into an old emotional role. They might bring up memories the two of you shared. They might echo the way you used to talk to each other. They might suddenly come across as warm, caring, or sentimental. But none of that is necessarily a sign of real emotional depth. Those are triggers meant to spark familiarity and reignite attachment. More often than not, their silence ends the moment they need something again, whether that's attention, validation, reassurance, or simply emotional access. And the message they send you is the opening move in figuring out whether that access still exists. What matters most to them isn't the depth of what you feel. What matters most is whether they still have the power to shape how you feel. That's why their outreach often leaves you feeling emotionally scrambled. One moment it feels caring, the next it feels distant or oddly inconsistent, sometimes even quietly manipulative. Their communication tends to revolve around meeting their own needs rather than being emotionally honest with you. Once you start recognizing this pattern for what it is, the entire situation begins to look completely different. When someone like this reaches out after a stretch of silence, how you respond in that first moment carries real weight. People who operate this way tend to watch your emotional reactions very closely. In some sense, they treat emotions like a system they're constantly testing and analyzing. They pick up on timing, tone, vulnerability, hesitation, and any opening you give them. Your very first reply usually reveals more than you realize. Whether it's long or short, emotional or flat, immediate or delayed, all of it gets interpreted and weighed. If you respond right away, they might assume you're still emotionally reachable. If you respond angrily, they might still take that as proof you're invested. If you respond with sadness or open up emotionally, they might see an opening to steer your feelings in a particular direction. Even a neutral-sounding reply can carry meaning if it includes explanations, emotional context, or too much openness. This is also why people like this tend to be so deliberate about timing. They understand the psychological weight of showing up unexpectedly. They know that most people react emotionally before they think things through logically. They often bank on emotional reflexes taking over rather than measured, careful thinking. They're counting on memories, loneliness, pain, confusion, or hope to move faster than your boundaries can catch up. When your reaction shows that they still have some pull over your emotional state, it gives them a sense of control or confidence. It signals that the door to emotional access might still be cracked open. One important thing to keep in mind is that people like this often respond more to behavior than to the actual words being said. Someone can say, "I'm done with this," over and over again. But if their behavior still shows emotional reactivity underneath, it can end up signaling the exact opposite of what they intended to say. Your reaction essentially shapes their next move. If you come across as hurt, they might shift into a sympathetic tone. If you come across as angry, they might position themselves as the misunderstood one, or even play the victim. If you come across as hopeful, they might respond with affection or encouragement to keep that hope alive. If you come across as guilty, they might ramp up the emotional pressure or keep pushing. In a lot of ways, your emotional reaction becomes their reference point for how to move forward. That's exactly why staying emotionally calm matters so much. A steady level response throws off the pattern they're expecting. A delayed reply, a controlled tone, or simply choosing not to respond at all creates uncertainty on their end. And uncertainty tends to be something they struggle to sit with, because it chips away at their sense of influence. A calm, minimal response takes away the emotional reaction they were hoping to get. It disrupts the script they had already planned out in their head. In that moment, their confidence about still having emotional access to you starts to crack. When people like this return after going silent, their tone is usually carefully chosen ahead of time. They rarely come in aggressive right out of the gate. Instead, they typically lead with familiarity, warmth, nostalgia, or a softer emotional approach. These tactics are designed to lower your guard quickly. They might suddenly seem kind, thoughtful, reflective, concerned, or emotionally exposed. Or they might present themselves as stressed, confused, lonely, overwhelmed, or emotionally unstable. Both of these approaches usually serve the exact same purpose underneath. The goal is to wear down your emotional defenses. Softness can make you forget how much distance and pain there actually was. Vulnerability can stir up empathy and compassion in you. And empathy happens to be something they often know exactly how to trigger when it works in their favor. In certain situations, what looks like genuine vulnerability isn't necessarily emotional honesty at all. It can simply be another method of influence dressed up to look sincere. This matters because emotional distance tends to bring real clarity. As time passes and space opens up, the emotional noise starts to quiet down. Your thinking becomes clearer. The intensity of your feelings starts to ease. Your confidence gradually starts coming back. At the same time, people like this often notice when that emotional distance is growing. And once they sense their influence slipping, they tend to shift how they communicate. They might suddenly become softer, more understanding, more thoughtful, or more emotionally open than before. This shift can create real internal conflict for you. It might make you wonder if they've actually changed, or if things could genuinely be different this time. And this is exactly where the confusion tends to creep in, because temporary softness gets mistaken for lasting change far too often. But real emotional growth shows up consistently over time. Behavior that only shifts when access is on the line isn't the same thing as stable, lasting transformation. Their warmth tends to intensify right when they're afraid of losing access to you. Their vulnerability tends to increase right when they need reassurance. Their openness tends to show up right when they sense distance growing between you. That's exactly why their messages can sometimes feel oddly personal, almost like they know precisely what once got to you emotionally. And in many cases, they genuinely do remember. They remember what once softened your boundaries. They remember what made you forgive them quickly. They remember what kept you emotionally engaged, even during the hardest moments. They remember the specific words and phrases that once created hope or a sense of connection. And they use all of that strategically, not necessarily to heal anything, but often simply to regain access. The intention behind their warmth isn't always about reconnecting on a genuine level. More often, it's about getting back in. So many people end up falling back into these same old cycles because they mistake a brief moment of emotional softness for real, lasting change. But patterns always end up revealing the truth eventually. When you choose not to respond after someone like this returns, something different starts happening on a psychological level. Silence throws off the entire emotional system they were counting on. People who rely on emotional reactions from others start losing their reference point when that reaction never comes. Anger, sadness, longing, over-explaining, or any kind of emotional engagement all give them something to work with and interpret. Silence takes all of that away completely. And when there's no emotional feedback at all, uncertainty starts to build. That lack of response creates real discomfort for them because it breaks the emotional loop they were expecting to unfold. Choosing not to respond isn't about proving a point to anyone. It's about cutting off emotional access entirely. In a lot of situations, silence becomes one of the strongest boundaries you can set simply because it refuses to feed into these emotional cycles. It communicates something powerful without a single word. It shows that your emotional energy is no longer being directed toward that connection. It shows that your sense of peace no longer depends on whether they're present or absent from your life. This can be genuinely difficult for someone who thrives on emotional influence because silence takes away their sense of impact entirely. It creates real uncertainty about where they stand and whether they still matter to you. At the same time, silence also protects your own inner clarity. Even small interactions can reopen old emotional wounds. A single message has the power to slowly drag old patterns back into your life. A polite reply can spiral into renewed engagement before you even realize what's happening. A conversation can restart a cycle that once felt nearly impossible to walk away from. Silence keeps that cycle from starting up again. It gives you room to observe instead of react. It allows your emotional stability to return without constant interference. It shields your nervous system from being thrown into turmoil again. It carves out psychological space where clarity can slowly find its way back. And most importantly, silence becomes a boundary that doesn't need to be explained or justified to anyone. You're not obligated to hand over emotional access to someone who has repeatedly disrupted your peace of mind. What makes silence such a powerful tool is that it gets interpreted very differently depending on someone's emotional maturity. A grounded, emotionally healthy person might see your silence as simply needing space, as closure, or as plain disinterest, and they'll respect it without pushing further. But someone with more manipulative tendencies often reads silence as a loss of control over you. This can push them to try harder to reach you, to shift their emotional tone, or to intensify their efforts to win back your attention. And these kinds of reactions often reveal far more about them than their words ever could. Because if their intentions were genuinely respectful, they would honor your distance without a fight. When someone keeps pushing despite your silence, it usually points to self-interest rather than any real understanding or respect for what you need. This is exactly why silence has a way of exposing someone's true intentions so quickly. It reveals what's really driving them without needing a single confrontation. Even though silence can feel uncomfortable at first, it often supports your healing far more effectively than staying emotionally engaged ever could. Genuine recovery requires real distance from repeated emotional disruption, and silence naturally creates exactly that kind of space. Of course, there are situations where total silence simply isn't realistic. Some people share children, workplaces, or other responsibilities that make complete distance impossible. In those cases, emotional neutrality becomes an incredibly powerful form of protection. Emotional neutrality means responding without intensity, without exposing vulnerability, without anger, and without slipping into emotional storytelling that reopens old attachments. People with these manipulative patterns tend to pay closer attention to emotional energy than to the actual words being exchanged. They notice tone, urgency, openness, and how psychologically available you seem. When you communicate with neutrality, you give them almost nothing to work with, and that alone shifts the entire dynamic between you. Neutrality isn't about being cold or trying to punish someone. It's simply about staying emotionally steady no matter what they bring to the table, and staying steady, more than almost anything else, is what ultimately protects your peace. There's another layer to all of this that's worth sitting with for a moment. And it has to do with why so many people struggle to walk away even when they logically know better. It isn't a matter of intelligence or even self-awareness. It comes down to how deeply certain emotional patterns get wired into us over time. When someone repeatedly gave you small doses of affection, followed by long stretches of distance, your nervous system actually adapted to that rhythm. You started associating their return with relief, even excitement, because the uncertainty of not knowing when they'd come back created its own kind of tension that only their presence seemed to resolve. That's not weakness. That's simply how attachment works when it gets repeatedly disrupted and repaired in an inconsistent way. Understanding this can help you stop blaming yourself for feeling pulled back in, while still giving you the clarity to choose a different response this time around. It also helps to recognize that the version of them you remember fondly, the warmth, the charm, the moments that felt genuinely good, was real in the sense that you experienced it, but it was never the full picture, and it was rarely sustainable. People who operate from this kind of pattern tend to show their best selves in short bursts, especially during the early stages of reconnecting or rebuilding trust. That's often when the charm is turned all the way up because it serves a purpose. The inconsistency, the withdrawal, the silence, those tend to creep back in once they feel secure in their access again. So if their message brings back memories of the good moments, it helps to remind yourself honestly that those moments existed alongside everything else, not instead of it. Something else worth understanding is how easily guilt gets used as a lever in these situations. A person returning after silence might frame things in a way that makes you feel responsible for how they've been struggling, or they might imply that your distance caused them pain, even though they were the one who created the distance in the first place. This kind of subtle reversal can be incredibly disorienting because it shifts the focus away from their behavior and onto your reaction to it. Recognizing this tactic for what it is, rather than absorbing the guilt as if it belongs to you, is one of the clearest ways to protect your emotional footing. Their pain, if it's even genuine, is not automatically your responsibility to soothe, especially not at the cost of your own well-being. It's also worth mentioning that healing from this kind of dynamic isn't usually a straight line. You might feel strong and clear for weeks, only to feel a wave of doubt or longing the moment a message like this shows up. That doesn't mean you failed or that you're back at square one. It simply means you're human. And old patterns take time to fully rewire. The goal isn't to never feel the pull again. The goal is to recognize the pull when it happens and choose your response deliberately instead of reacting on autopilot. Every time you do that, even imperfectly, you're building a new pattern, one where your peace doesn't hinge on whether they're present or absent, warm or cold, silent or suddenly talkative again. If you find yourself in this exact situation right now, staring at a message from someone who once brought more chaos than comfort into your life, give yourself permission to pause before responding. You don't owe anyone an immediate reply, and you certainly don't owe them access to your emotional world just because they decided to reopen the door. Take the time you need to check in with yourself honestly. Ask what you actually want, not what feels urgent in the moment, but what genuinely serves your peace over the long run. Sometimes that answer is no response at all. Sometimes it's a brief, neutral reply that closes the door gently but firmly. Either way, the power lies in the fact that you get to decide on your terms without being pulled back into a script someone else has already written for you. At the end of the day, understanding these patterns isn't about becoming cynical or assuming the worst about everyone who ever reaches back out after distance. Some reconnections are genuine. Some people do grow and change in real sustainable ways. But that kind of change tends to show up through consistent action over time, not through a single well-timed message after weeks of silence. So trust the pattern more than the promise. Watch what happens after the initial warmth fades. Notice whether the old cycles start creeping back in once they feel secure again. And above all, keep protecting the clarity and peace you've worked so hard to build, because that peace is worth more than any temporary sense of being wanted by someone who only shows up when it serves them.